Good morning, I'm Dave Christie with your LaRouche Organization Daily Update for Friday, September 26th. Covering for Harley Schlanger today. He has a busy day of interviews, so you can track him down on some of those interviews. Otherwise, sign up for the International Peace Coalition meeting on the schillerinstitute.com site. Now, we're clearly on a knife's edge with the strategic situation, both in the attempts to use the drones as a kind of a false flag to draw the United States back into the direct confrontation with Russia. And of course, we have the ongoing situation with the British hand grenade in the Middle East, otherwise known as their former Mandate of Palestine and today known as Israel. Certainly they're coming under severe pressure surrounding the Gaza genocide, as we've seen from statements coming out of the United Nations. And of course, we have fears that they may respond with another attack on Iran. Both of those conflicts, the situation with Iran and as well the ongoing situation in Ukraine, have dangers of escalating into thermonuclear confrontation. Now, in that context, I think it's just important to recognize that the drive for war is out of the desperation by the dying and collapsing British Empire, that their financial system is disintegrating under the weight of over $2 quadrillion of derivatives that could never be paid, on the back of a collapsing physical economy that those derivatives are effectively a parasite on the host of the physical economy. Not only is the collapse underway, but a new system is emerging around the BRICS dynamics, and those nations who were the host of the parasitic British imperial system out of the City of London and Wall Street have rejected their host, or has rejected being a host, and are instead moving to the new system represented by the BRICS. So that's the context of the war drive. Now, we have some motion, though, to potentially disrupt the deep state drive for war, namely that of exposing some of the key players in Russiagate. So as you've probably seen by now, we had the indictment of Jim Comey, the former FBI director. He's been indicted by a grand jury in the Eastern District of Virginia, largely stemming around claims or accusations that he made false statements, lying to Congress around his 2020 testimony before the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee on the FBI's Crossfire Hurricane, which was one of the integral parts of Comey's operation surrounding Russiagate. Trump, of course, on Truth Social came out calling Comey one of the most corrupt, the former corrupt head of the FBI, now at the beginning of being held responsible for his crimes against our nation. Certainly Trump has been no fan of Jim Comey. Comey's responded saying that he and his family have known there would be costs to standing up to Donald Trump, but fear is the tool of a tyrant, and so on and so forth. Now, the other aspect of the coup apparatus, which in addition to Russiagate is a kind of a domestic regime change operation, we also have the Department of Justice investigating the role of George Soros and his sprawling NGO complex. Now, some of this is around the dark money that goes into what is often described as left-wing operations, the Marxists and the communists and so on. Now, that's actually false in the following sense, because, was it left-wing when Soros literally worked under the Nazis along with his father as a young man under Nazi occupation, pointing out the houses of his fellow Jews to be confiscated by the Nazis and so on. He described it to CBS back in 60 Minutes interview back in the 1990s as one of the happiest moments of his life, or however he referred to it. You can find that. But or was it left wing when Soros funded, through his NGO complex, funded the overthrow of the Yanukovych government by the Bandera collaborators of the former collaborators of Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. I don't think these are exactly left-wing groups, but that was, to the degree that Soros supports the so-called left, the Marxists, the communists, and all that, it's under British counterinsurgency tactics. This is the means by which the British managed their lost colonies after World War II by supporting and running counter-gang operations. For example, take what Frank Kitson did in Northern Ireland. Kitson, of course, was a military officer, eventually in the higher ranks, but Kitson it would infiltrate the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, and then do bombing campaigns against civilian targets, then, of course, turning around and blaming it on the IRA. Well, of course, he had infiltrated it. But that would then be the insurgency there was then, the counterinsurgency was then brought in to police and bring in military units to secure the peace, so-called, right? So that's how Kitson and this counterinsurgency strategy worked. He was not only awarded for his efforts with knighthood, but actually became the aide-de-camp to none other than Queen Elizabeth II. But that's how this works. The counterinsurgency strategy is to pit the left against the right. This is the strategy of tension that we have discussed on this channel and have discussed for a long time, going back to the Red Brigades and the kidnapping of Aldo Moro and so on. All of these are run by MI6 and their collaborators and CIA and so forth. Now, in terms of the other British roots of Soros, recall that one of his key financial warfare tools against nations was called the Quantum Fund. And this was part of his financial speculation operations that Soros ran on the economies of nations like Italy, Malaysia, others. In fact, actually, the former Prime Minister of Malaysia, Dr. Mahathir, effectively charged Soros with crimes against humanity for these types of financial speculative operations. But one of the biggest clients of Soros' Quantum Fund was also none other than Queen Elizabeth II. So you get the idea. This guy is nothing but a British operative. And he did have a role in the Russiagate operation along with Comey and others. And whereas Comey can cry about being targeted by the tyrant, we know from the Director of National Intelligence documents, the Office of Director of National Intelligence headed by Tulsi Gabbard, that she's already released documents that show that Comey, Jim Clapper, John Brennan of the CIA, Clapper was DNI, they overrode the opposition of their own analysts in the FBI, analysts of NSA, who said that they did not have the evidence or did not find the inclusion of the Steele dossier, famous for these claims of the P-tapes they had on Trump, as well as the alleged Russian GRU hack of the DNC, that there was not sufficient evidence of those to be included in the intelligence community assessment that was used to launch Russiagate and Crossfire Hurricane and the various operations. We also know that the former head of NSA, Mike Rogers, told Clapper directly that he hadn't seen the evidence of the hack. So if NSA hasn't seen the evidence, that means it didn't exist. Now, the other part of the operation launching Russiagate was, of course, Soros' operation, and as we know from the DNA documents of Tulsi Gabbard, that the executive director of Soros Open Society Foundation, Leonardo Bernardo, played his role in Russiagate. It was sort of presented as a way to distract from Hillary Clinton's email campaign, blame it on the Russians, all these matters. But I think just in reality, I think we have to be very clear that Russiagate was the operation by the British for a regime change operation, and Soros collaborators, like Christopher Steele, the former MI6 operative who worked directly with the former head of MI6, Richard Dearlove, as well as the role of Robert Hannigan. He was the director of GCHQ. There were claims that GCHQ was providing NSA an intelligence bypass to be able to spy on Trump Towers and the transition team and all of these matters. But and it was likely that that was the whole narrative around the Russian hack was hatched between Hannigan and CIA director at the time, John Brennan, in the summer of 2016, when they had an emergency director level meeting, likely again to discuss the plans to use the narrative of the Russian hack of the DNC as one of the underpinnings of Russiagate. And of course, both the Steele dossier and that hack were included, overriding, again, as I mentioned before, the opposition that we saw from the others in the intelligence community. But the other point that we made in our white paper on the actual origins of Russiagate, that this was all designed in order to get to prevent Trump's at least stated intentions for a rapprochement with Russia in his first term, to cloud that and ensure that the narrative against Russia was continued for a war, for the coming war that we are now in the middle of. Now, on that front, in terms of the war front, we see the continued desperation voiced by mouthpieces of the British establishment that continues. Diane mentioned yesterday the articles in the Telegraph and so on that indicate that Trump is intending Trump's statement about his support for Ukraine and that they can take everything back to the original borders, 1991 borders and so on. That means Crimea as well. Trump's supposed support for that, the British don't quite see it that way. And in fact, the Financial Times followed up that said that Trump's essentially intending to put the onus on Europe to fight the war. It says that the Financial Times says that several European officials are speculating that Trump intends to shift responsibility for Ukraine's defense to Europe, that through his statement that they can take it all back, that the U.S. leader has set the bar very high, and that this their Financial Times sources say that this is just that Trump is preparing an exit strategy so he can blame Europe for failure, when and if necessary. So that continues to be the fear of the British, that the U.S. may indeed bail on Project Ukraine. So what's their response? Hype up the drone issue. We've seen that there's drones everywhere. Poland, Romania. Now it's recently Denmark. There was drones apparently or supposedly over an air base that hosts the F-35s. However, it could indicate more. I just want to cite Andrei Kartopolov, who is the head of the Russian State Duma's Defense Committee. And he, in referring to the drone issue, he said that the Europeans don't have the courage to do anything more serious. But then he went on to say, but we must understand that perhaps under the cover of this chatter, there is a secret deployment and preparation for redeploying aircraft and air defense systems to the border with Russia or Ukraine. We are closely monitoring the situation and have already recorded the movement of a number of aircraft from France and the UK. So, if these kind of operations are under cover of this whole drone false flag scenarios, that's dangerous. And it should be seen in the context of what Sergei Lavrov said yesterday at a G20 ministerial meeting. This was on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly. But Lavrov said that this was, that the West is now directly participating in the war. He says it's a manifestation of their neo-colonial ambitions. So I just want to read what he said. Lavrov again said, another clear example is the Western-provoked crisis in Ukraine, through which NATO and European Union have already declared an actual war on my country and are directly participating in it. So I think that just gives an indication of how the Russians are seeing that. So these kind of games by the British and their NATO lackeys are dangerous. And so now, if indeed Trump is intending to pull out of this, we don't know what this means, but there's an unprecedented meeting that Hegseth has called in Quantico, Virginia, where all the top generals, the 800 some generals, are being called back for this meeting. We have no idea what this meeting is about. It's slated for next week, but it's certainly significant. But if Trump indeed intends to pull out of the Ukraine fiasco, he's got to be direct about it. Moreover, he's got to work with the nations of the BRICS, particularly Russia, India, and China. Otherwise, these false flag operations are just going to accelerate, and thus the pressure as well on him to remain in the Ukraine fiasco. But the only real solution, way to get out of this morass is to join with the BRICS nations on a new security and development architecture. That is what Helga Tsep-LaRouche has maintained through the entirety of these conflicts, and it will be the kind of security and development architecture that can deal with all global crises, whether that be the current operations in Gaza, Trump saying he won't let the Israelis move into the West Bank, but anyway, all of these matters can only be resolved under a higher manifold. And moreover, we need immediate collaboration with these nations to deal with the impending financial collapse, the end of the Casino Royale system of London and their quadrillions of dollars of derivatives. We need immediately Glass-Steagall in that context, the provisions of Glass-Steagall. That is precisely how you would prevent the speculative operations of Soros and being used for the, counterinsurgency gang, counter gang, left-right tactics of the British. So, and the rest of the world wants the United States to join this. I just want to read part of what Subianto, the president of Indonesia, said at the UN General Assembly. I believe he spoke immediately after Donald Trump, and he said, we are first and foremost as fellow human beings, each created equal, endowed with unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The words of the U.S. Declaration of Independence have inspired democratic movements across continents. And he refers to some of the other revolutions. He says it also gave birth to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights adopted by the UN in 1948. All men are created equal was the creed that opened the way to unprecedented global prosperity and dignity. So on the eve of our 250th anniversary of the founding of this republic, we should recognize that that's what the rest of the world wants us to be, and we can be, and that is what we at the LaRouche organization intend. Join with us in this mobilization.